Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see you again. My name is Dustin Cormier. Welcome to How to Rock Astrology. We're continuing our reading of Light on Life, an introduction to the Astrology of India. This episode, we are going to be talking about planetary associations and aspects, which is basically all of the aspects that we consider in Parashar's system of astrology in particular, in Vedic astrology. Now, as we're about to read, there are different types of aspects. There is a particular mode used in this book, and I'm going to talk about, other types as we kind of go along. But this episode is essentially on, opposite aspects, conjunction, what the Westerners understand as trines and such. These are what we're going to be talking about today, in the Vedic sense. It's beginning our subheading of Chapter 4. We're on Chapter 4 right now, talking about the Grahas, planets. So the subheading is Planetary Association and Aspects. So this is us riffing more, continuing our lessons, describing the Grahas and their effect on the astrology chart. The authors begin. By virtue of their positions in certain constellations, planets influence other constellations. These special influences are known as aspects. So it's basically a planet is going to aspect certain constellations from itself. Mars in Aquarius is going to influence certain other signs and all the planets inside that sign. This is how Vedic astrology, particular Parashar's system, does it. The aspects in this book, as we read, are primarily those of Parashari system. In Jaimini's system, it is the constellations and not the planets which aspect one another. That really is a conversation for another day. Parashara tends to be the main system that most people employ generally, at least in the English-speaking world in particular when it comes to Vedic astrology. But Jaimini is very important, and I'm going to talk about Jaimini more outside of this lesson series. While in the Tajika system, planets aspect within certain orbs of influence, much as in the Western astrology, where there's actually a certain amount of particular angles to the planets. And that's actually what I use. If I'm going to see a trine, Mars at the end of Aquarius can be trine to, let's say, Venus at the beginning of Scorpio. Is that right? In the trinal sense. So Mars at the end of Aquarius would be trining basically, something at the start of Scorpio or Cancer, even though they're not in trine signs. But I digress. Again, this book focuses on the sign trines, and I consider that those both are important. But in order to learn both, we got to learn step by step, and that's why we're beginning with the Jyotish basics, which is this Parashari system. Influences in Parashari, Jyotish, are by association and by full, special, or partial aspects, as we're going to describe. Don't let it get too thick for you. Association simply means that two planets are in the same sign together, even if they're not conjunct. A full aspect is an opposition, and then each planet has its own special aspects and partial aspects. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is association, which is essentially when two planets or more are in the same sign, when they occupy the same constellation. Now, I'm going to start showing us some examples here so we can see what we're talking about. So an example of association here is this second house, Sun, Jupiter, and Rahu, they all influence one another because they are in association in the sign of Cancer. Of course, this number 4 means Cancer, right? These are both the same chart, and this is the north chart. The number 3 here represents Gemini, which means that this is a Gemini rising, just as we can see it in the southern chart. The number 4 represents Cancer. Now, planets also influence constellations and houses by association. Not just the sign, but the house. Every planet is associated with, and consequently influences, the constellation and the house that it occupies. Here in Chart 1, for example, both Mercury and Venus influence the 3rd house and the constellation of Leo, which they occupy. Because, see, number 5 is the 5th sign, so that's how we know that this is Leo. And here, just in case this is confusing you, this is the sign of Leo, where Mercury and Venus are. The number 3 here just simply means that it's the 3rd house, right? In the southern chart, the signs are implied, so they have to show the houses to show which house each sign is. In the north system, the houses are implied, so they need to use these numbers to define what the signs are. Just in case you didn't, and just in case we weren't clear on that. Now, all planets, that was our explanation of association, just kind of like conjunction in a way. So you might read later, for example, that, if we're trying to discuss the nature of a Libra rising chart for whom Jupiter is in the 1st house. Jupiter is the 9th lord, which is positive, but is also the 6th lord. We're going to talk about that, but Jupiter is usually seen as a benefic in the 1st house. But in Libra, Jupiter and Venus aren't exactly friends, they're enemies. So Jupiter being in Libra is going to expand in a benevolent way. But will it be a good way or a bad way? Generally, it'll be neutral. And if Jupiter is associated with a malefic, then it'll expand on the bad parts of that malefic, typically. Particularly the Sun in Libra with Jupiter. Jupiter will expand the heavier parts because the Sun doesn't like Libra either. The point is that whenever you see that if this planet is associated with a malefic, then it will cause trouble. It just means that they're in the same sign and are affecting each other's constellation and therefore affecting each other. Now, on to the next type of aspect is what we call the full aspect, a planet being in full aspect to another planet, which is essentially the same thing as an opposition in Western terms. It's usually demarcated by this little opposite sign, right? All planets fully aspect the 7th constellation counted inclusively from the constellation that they occupy, right? So the house that the planet's in is always the 1st house. 7 houses away from that is the full aspect house. For example, any planet which occupies the constellation of Gemini automatically influences by aspect the 7th constellation from Gemini, which happens to be Sagittarius, right? Let's just take another look at this here chart. We know that Gemini is the 1st, Cancer is the 2nd, Leo is the 3rd house, Virgo is the 4th house, Libra is the 5th house, Scorpio is the 6th house, and Sagittarius is the 7th house from Gemini. Here the same thing on the southern side. Gemini is the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th would be Sagittarius, right? In chart 2, we see that the moon and Mars, who occupy Gemini, right? This is Gemini. This is a Virgo rising chart, so we can see that Gemini would be in the 10th house. Moon and Mars, who occupy the sign of Gemini, influence Sagittarius by their full 7th aspects. They also influence any planet or planets occupying Sagittarius, which in this horoscope happens to be Jupiter and Saturn. Jupiter and Saturn return the favor by aspecting Gemini and the 2 planets associated therein, for better or worse. You can see this opposition aspect between Moon and Mars and Gemini, and Saturn and Jupiter, and Sagittarius. So those are essentially the full aspect. There's something to be said about the nature of a full aspect as opposed to an association. But in Vedic astrology, it's not considered as inherently intense or bad or conflicting as it is in Western astrology. It's kind of given that damage is kind of given short thrift, except by intuition. The astrologer knows that the moon in Gemini is doing one thing, and Venus in Sagittarius is doing the opposite thing, but in the same way. They're mirrors for each other, and therefore they're kind of bound to bang into each other in some ways, because the moon in Gemini gets comfort by being open and chatty and outright and spontaneous towards what's outside of itself and pays attention to what's outside of itself. Whereas the Venus in Sagittarius enjoys romantically, buoyantly expressing spontaneous things from within itself, going by its own regard, and sort of traveling the world and kind of paying less attention to people, giving itself the capacity to fling around and not pay attention to people. And the moon and Venus are opposite in that way, but the aspect, whether it's good or bad, is all about whether Venus and the moon are in a good relationship, a natural relationship or not. In which case, we find that this tends up being a mutual or a one-sided aspect, actually. We shouldn't call it a one-sided aspect, but Venus is starved by the moon, and the moon is delighted by Venus. We're going to find that later, but the point is that this isn't necessarily a bad. Oppositions aren't bad in Vedic astrology. It's only bad if the planets don't get along. Right? So those were full aspects, the opposition. Now we have something called special aspects. And this is going to take more diagrams to really get underneath. In addition to the full 7th house aspects, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn also have what are called special aspects, and this is particular to Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. These are as strong as association and as the full 7th aspect common to all planets. All planets have this is a full strength aspect, just like being associated in the same sign and just like being in the opposite sign. Now, let's take a look at what these are. First, we start with Mars. Mars aspects the 4th and 8th constellations from its position. So here we have chart 1. I see. This is still chart 1 we have here. It's the Gemini rising with all that stuff happening in the sign of Cancer. Now we see here that Mars is in the sign of Aries. And we're trying to think of what are Mars's aspects. Well, Mars has an aspect on the 4th house from itself. Of course, we know Cancer is the 4th sign, Aries being 1, Taurus being the 2nd, Gemini being the 3rd, and Cancer being the 4th sign from Aries. Mars also has its opposite aspect, the full aspect, where we see here this Mars is opposite to the moon in Libra, and that's a full aspect. And as well, Mars also has an 8th house aspect. So what's unique to Mars is that it doesn't have trines. It doesn't have trines like the other planets do. This is just the way Mars works and the way it is. It's interesting we could think about any kind of symbology related to this. Most other planets, like the Sun, Mercury, Moon, Venus, well, the Sun, Moon, Mercury, and Venus, anyway, those 4, they have trines, and they are interacting by the support towards the signs that are of the same element as them. They're working through the same houses and elements, the trinal signs from themselves. Mars doesn't do this. Mars interacts with the 4th house from itself, the 4th sign from itself, the 7th sign from itself, which all other planets do as well, and the 8th. It's interesting to note that Mars rules Scorpio, which is the 8th sign. This goes to show that however Aries is the 1st sign, and Scorpio is the 8th sign from Aries, and Aries rules Mars. So there's a relationship between Aries and Scorpio and the 8th house significance. And there's also a relationship between wherever Mars is placed and the 8th from that. Because wherever Mars is placed, it's almost acting like an Aries in the sense. And the 8th from that position is like a Scorpio in the sense. This is just, plucking out some reasoning as to why Mars only aspects the 8th and the 7th and the 4th from itself. We could just for a giggle look at chart number 2. Now, can you guess which signs this Mars is going to interact with? We know right away that it's going to interact with Virgo, as well as that Sun, because that's the 4th from itself. We know that this Mars is going to interact with Saturn and Jupiter, as we said in the last example, from the full aspect. And then Mars is also going to aspect Capricorn, which is the 8th house from Gemini, the 8th sign from Gemini. You can see that happening here as well, right? So those are Mars's aspects. Now let's take a look at Jupiter's aspects. You guys with me here? Can you guys see what I'm getting at? Yeah. This is Jupiter. This is Jupiter's aspects. Now, Jupiter has these trinal aspects, and this is essentially just like the partial aspects of all the other planets. As you're gonna see, most planets go by trines like this, like we were talking about with the Sun, Mercury. I should have included Jupiter in that. Jupiter aspects the 5th and 9th positions from itself, which is essentially the trines, right? Here we have Jupiter in Cancer in the 2nd house. It is therefore influencing a Scorpio, the 5th house from itself, and Pisces, the 9th house from itself, which are, of course, the trinal positions from Jupiter. You can see that happening in this northern chart, too. Jupiter in the 2nd house is in trine with Scorpio, the 6th house, and Pisces, the 10th house. Okay. So we can sort of see that same thing with this Jupiter. Obviously, you must know that this Jupiter, being in Sagittarius, would also trine Aries and would also trine Virgo and that Rahu. So, the only reason that Jupiter is given a special emphasis, even though it's the trine, just like all the other planets, aside from these, it's considered one of the 3 special aspect planets. Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn have special aspects. The only reason Jupiter is a special is because This trine is considered a full-strength aspect, and if anything is in trine to Jupiter, it is jump-started and is always benevolent, always benefic. Jupiter is the great benefic of astrology, and it fully gives to whatever is in trine to it. It's always a good lucky boon to have that happening. Now Saturn influences. Saturn is the final special aspect planet. It doesn't go by trines. Saturn aspects the 3rd, the 7th, and the 10th constellations from its position. So here we have Saturn in chart 1. Saturn is in Gemini in that first house, as we see here. It's aspecting the 3rd house from itself, where Venus and Mercury are. It's aspecting the 7th house from itself, the sign of Sagittarius. And it's aspecting the 10th house and sign, that being Pisces for a Gemini, right? Here we see Saturn in Gemini. It's aspecting the 3rd house from itself, Gemini being the 1st, Cancer is the 2nd, Leo is the 3rd house. The Saturn's also aspecting the 7th house from itself, Sagittarius, and the 10th house from itself, that being Pisces. So again, just for a laugh, we can apply this as well to Saturn in any position, like this Saturn in Sagittarius. Here, Saturn, where do you think it's going to be aspecting? It's going to be aspecting the 3rd from itself, which is Aquarius. It's going to be aspecting the 7th sign from itself, right? So Sagittarius is the 1st, Capricorn is the 2nd, Aquarius is the 3rd, Pisces is the 4th, Aries is the 5th, Taurus is the 6th, Gemini is the 7th from Saturn. And then the 10th house from this Saturn is Virgo. And so that Saturn would be aspecting a full aspect on Virgo and the Sun in this chart. So, the authors go on to tell us a little bit here. In chart number 1, okay, this is us coming back to chart number 1. This is just basically, I'm going to be repeating what we just kind of said, but through the author's vantage. Chart number 1, Mars occupies the constellation of Aries. From this aspect, from this position, it aspects Libra by its 7th aspect, Cancer by its 4th aspect, and Scorpio by its 8th aspect. Jupiter, which occupies Cancer here, similarly influences Scorpio by its 5th aspect, as well as Pisces by its 9th aspect. Saturn, who here tenants Gemini, influences Leo by its 3rd aspect, and Pisces by its 10th aspect, all counted inclusively from the constellation where the planet resides. Any planets placed in these aspected constellations are also influenced accordingly. In this chart, Mars affects Jupiter. Yes, because that Jupiter, as we can see, that Mars aspects that Jupiter in Cancer by its 4th aspect. In fact, it gets the Sun, Jupiter, and Rahu by that 4th aspect. And it also influences the Moon by its 7th aspect. Now, Jupiter here Jupiter affects Ketu, by its 7th aspect. I didn't even write that in. But that does count. Jupiter also has 7th aspects. All of the planets have the 7th house aspect. So keep that in mind. I should have written that in. And Saturn here affects Mercury and Venus by its 3rd house aspect. Now, of course, with astrology, you got to consider that while Saturn is good friends with Mercury and Venus, Saturn is still a malefic and puts a negative pressure on Leo and these planets. And the house, the 3rd house. Rahu and Ketu are said by some Jyotishis to cast a full aspect on the 5th and 9 constellations counted inclusively from their position. I didn't make a slide for that, but once again, I should have. But Rahu and Ketu, they don't really have the seventh house aspect, because then that's just Rahu, right? If you're counting the seventh house from Ketu, and you're trying to say, this Ketu is aspecting the sun and Jupiter, you wouldn't say that. You would just say that Rahu is associated with the sun and Jupiter. But this Rahu in Cancer is definitely aspecting Pisces and Scorpio in the same way that Jupiter would. Now, up next we have mutual and one-sided aspects. Of course, we can see that a planet like Saturn can be aspecting one planet, while that planet is not giving Saturn the same aspect. Same thing with Mars. But when two planets aspect each other, this is considered a mutual aspect. This can happen by association, full aspect, or special aspect. Technically, like Rahu and Ketu and Jupiter can have the trine to, like the sun, for example, and then the sun is trine Jupiter, and that's a mutual aspect. Oppositions are always a mutual aspect. If the moon is opposite Saturn, then Saturn is also opposite the moon. In the case of association, the planets occupy the same constellation. In the case of the full aspect, they aspect the seventh from each other, from which positions they gaze at each other, and they're affected by that gaze, by the seeing each other and confronting each other so really. Only one mutual special aspect can occur. It's between Saturn and Mars, when Mars occupies the 10th constellation from Saturn. So, that's actually the case in my chart. So I've got Mars in Scorpio, and its fourth house aspect is hitting Aquarius. My Saturn is in Aquarius, which means that the 10th house from Aquarius is Scorpio, where my Mars is, right? When a planet aspects another without the latter reciprocating, this is a one-sided aspect. And this is when they're not mutual, but when one planet is hitting the other and it doesn't come the other way. This situation always involves the special aspects of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. For example, in chart 2, we see that Mars is aspecting the sun, but the sun does not aspect Mars. This is a one-sided aspect. Here, this Mars in Gemini is giving its aspect to the sun in Virgo, because the Mars affects the fourth sign from itself. But the sun does not give that same aspect back to Mars. So it's a one-sided aspect. So then we have partial aspects. Besides their full and special aspects, the planets Sun through Saturn also have partial aspects. Every planet except Mars has a 75% aspect on the 4th and 8th constellations counted from where they sit. All planets except Jupiter have a 50% aspect on the 5th and 9th constellations so counted, which means that Jupiter's aspect is full. But when the sun is in trine with, say, Mars, it's only a 50% aspect. Same thing with any planet, basically, essentially. I showed an example of Mercury in this chart. Mercury being in the sign of Leo in chart 1. This Mercury hits the trines to itself, the trinal signs, that being Aries and Sagittarius, since it's in Leo, as well as the 7th. And in this case, this Mercury is hitting this Mars, technically, but it is only a 50% aspect, just because that's the nature of the partial aspects. And as well, all planets except Saturn have a 25% aspect on the 3rd and 10th constellations from themselves. This isn't the most commonly used thing, especially because it's only 25% of an aspect. I would generally concede that the only real partial aspects are the full aspect. Well, the full aspect is a full aspect. But the trines, the trine aspect of the Sun, Mercury, Venus, and the Moon are partial aspects, and they count for something. But different astrologers do it in different ways, and essentially it's good for us to read the book on the text, and then for you to fish around to see what's your ideal method. But these full aspects are all agreed upon. And basically the trines of the partial aspects are all agreed upon. Now with Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, of course, they have full special aspects to these same places. In theory, these partial aspects exert some effect on the various factors of a horoscope. But in practice, a lot of Jyotishis do ignore them. That's what the book is telling us, kind of like I gave us the caveat there. As an astrologer, I use Kala software, and maybe I'll just give you guys just a glimpse of what exactly I'm referring to. But essentially, whenever you use Kala software, you can kind of see where these trines and things are anyways. And they are included and counted as parts of one's astrological analysis. For example, we can see here that Kala actually considers them the closeness to a trine. My Venus, and this is my chart, my Venus in my chart in Virgo is technically trine, as we can see, the moon. Venus is giving the moon a 32-point aspect. That has to do with the fact that it's not exactly really a trine, right? It's this Venus hitting this moon, Venus at 29 degrees, aspecting the moon at 7 degrees in Sagittarius. Now, that's not even a full trine because the moon isn't in Capricorn, right? But Kala considers that it's building up to the full aspect. This moon is building up to the full aspect of the trine from Venus. And that's why it's at that 32 mark. It's only half of a partial aspect, basically, right? So that's just an example of where things go when you start using Kala and you get quite specific. In his reckoning, in this book, you got to consider that this was written in 1996, before they had computers and before they had the ability to get the specifics on adding up all this data, adding up all these planetary aspects and their effects on the planets. So time has changed and turned the dial on that last little comment. But this is something that you're going to see as you move along. Come along in your lessons and along with me in my lessons on astrology. And especially, when you start using Kala, the wheel gets spinning in a very intense and precise mathematical way. But this book, the reason we're going through it is because there is a heart that needs to be preserved. A liquidy, poetic, Vedic Jyotirvidya, which needs to be preserved in its original spirit by astrologers who are not using computers to calculate them. And I think this book carries that spirit. So keep in mind that that's one of the reasons why I'm doing that book. But as usual, everything I do is a dialogue between different elements. In this case, this lesson is kind of a dialogue between the old way of astrology and the new way of using computers and technology. And I hope you guys enjoy the dialogue with me. That was our planetary aspects lesson for today. Stay tuned for the next one. We're going to be talking about planetary strengths and what is it that gives a planet dignity and strength in a chart with which to, like with all these aspects. We see Mars, for example, was in Gemini there, and it's aspecting the sun in Virgo in chart 2. Just for the sake of it, I'll show you. This Mars in Gemini is aspecting the sun in Virgo, and there's an aspect there because the sun is in the 4th house from Mars. Now the next question is, what is it that defines the strength of Mars? What is it that defines the strength of the sun? And what's going to happen when these two have this interaction with each other? It's not going to be so bad because Mars and the sun are good friends, but Mars is still a malefic and still putting some pressure on that sun. So how do we define how much strength is being pushed through these planets? There's a few different ways to do it, and we're going to find out in our next episode. So thanks for watching, everybody. I'm Dustin Cormier for How to Rock Astrology. Keep your eyes on the skies, and I'll see you on the next episode. I forgot to put about that. Blah.